Scientists say we have about as much time, 30 years, to really take hold of the crisis, and indeed that the next 10 years represent the decisive decade, that's what they call it, decisive decade, in which the future course of the planet will largely be determined. Which means that my life almost certainly will also contain that story too. What happens next, and what world we will design in response to this crisis. And your life, almost no matter how old you are, will also contain it, because that's what is meant by decisive decade. It's just a decade. It's also the decade in which we are beginning to really see the impacts, in the global north at least, which has long had the luxury of pretending, few natural disasters aside, that the climate crisis was a problem for other people living elsewhere, whose humanity we felt comfortable discounting when we even acknowledged it. When we acknowledged climate change too, we compartmentalized it. We thought it was just a matter of sea level rise. It was just one issue among many. Action against it could be put off, perhaps indefinitely. Perhaps we might innovate or adapt our way around the need to really dramatically redesign our world. A number of what behavioral economists call cognitive biases that have clouded our vision on climate is practically endless. But as we're learning more and more each year, indeed each month and really often each day, climate change is not a threat that can be compartmentalized or avoided. It is everywhere, all touching. And while there will be adaptation, of course, the question is fundamentally adapting to what? Take economics. There's considerable disagreement about the ultimate impact of climate change on economic growth, but some estimates suggest that unmitigated warming could reduce global GDP by 20% or 30% by the end of the century, compared to a world without climate change. Now, the world would still be getting richer, but it would be 20 or 30% less rich than it would have been without warming. 30% is an impact that is twice as deep as the Great Depression, and fundamentally, functionally, it would be permanent. Those same estimates suggest large portions of the world, some of them also the most densely populated, would be even harder hit, with South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa losing half or more of their potential for economic growth. And the scientists who work on those models have told me very clearly, those estimates are not a baseline on which we can project new adaptation. They already reflect measures of adaptation. Other economists are a bit sunnier. Older models have predicted just a few percentage points lost, even at levels of warming that would ultimately flood 2/3 of the world's major cities, which is one reason those models are no longer held in much esteem. More middle-of-the-road estimates suggest a cut to GDP of perhaps 15%. That's an impact equal to the Great Depression, compared to a world without climate change. Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, has recently taken to saying that his base case is for climate to cut global GDP by 25%. Keep in mind, we live in a country, at least, where expectations for economic growth are so important to our view of the future and our sense of current healthy prosperity and flourishing, that a decline in economic growth from 3 to 2% is enough to produce enormous political and social upheaval. Or take agriculture. As with many of the impacts of climate change, human innovation and adaptation will soften the blow. But estimates of the simple impact of temperature on the productivity of agriculture suggest that by the end of the century, with unmitigated warming, croplands could be considerably less productive than they are today. In theory, we could be using that food to feed 50% more people. There's a relationship between temperature and violence, which means, according to some analysis, by the end of the century, we could be seeing twice as much war as a result of climate change. And that relationship doesn't just impact violence at the state level, it also impacts violence at the individual level, so we would expect to see rates of rape and murder and domestic assault rise as well. We can already see that effect in local studies. Warming will make infectious disease worse, make extreme weather much more intense, fan the flames of wildfire, rupture old infrastructure, and destabilize national and local governments as well, who will be overwhelmed by the challenges that impacts pose. To name just a few of the obstacles to true human flourishing that climate change will yield. We don't get to choose whether we will focus on climate change in the decades ahead, only what path we will take in responding to it, and how equitably and humanely we'll manage the future we have made. Today, the planet's, depending on who you ask and what study you look at, 1.2, maybe 1.3, some people say 1.4 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial average. Now that doesn't sound like much, 1.2, 1.3, but it already places us entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose the entire history of human civilization. Which means that everything we have ever known as a species, from the invention of agriculture through the development of the modern nation state, antibiotics, computers, pop music, Hollywood, all that, is on some level the result of climate conditions that we have already left behind. The last time carbon concentrations were as high as they are today, the planet wasn't 1.2 or 1.3 degrees warmer, but about 3, maybe 4. There were forests at the South Pole, and sea levels weren't centimeters, but 20 meters higher. It's like we've already landed on a new planet with different climate conditions, and we have to figure out what of the civilization we've smuggled with us here can survive, what will have to be renovated and remodeled, and what will have to be discarded and replaced.